There's a misconception out there that when you're migrating your applications to the cloud, if there's a SaaS alternative, software as a service, then you automatically have to migrate your application to software as a service, so replacing the application with a SaaS alternative. And if there is no SaaS alternative, then at the very least, you have to re-architect or redesign your application for platform as a service or PaaS. And that IaaS should really not be used and customers should avoid IaaS at all costs. Today, we're going to unpack all of that. Stick around. This is going to be a lot of fun. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Elias Khnaser, and today we're going to answer the question, how do you decide between IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS when you're migrating your applications to the public cloud? Now, if you like this type of content, make sure you like, subscribe, leave a comment below. Let me know if you agree with all of the things that I'm going to go through in this video, and if there's anything that I've missed, make sure you also hit that notification bell so that you're alerted the next time I upload a video. So is it true that just because there's a SaaS alternative, then you automatically have to migrate your application to SaaS? The answer is definitively no. However, it is recommended that you take a SaaS first approach, meaning do your homework, assess the viability of the SaaS application first and foremost. Now, as you're looking into SaaS, there could be a lot of roadblocks that arise that might convince you that SaaS is not the right option for migrating this application. For example, the first thing that I would recommend that you do is do a feature comparison between what you currently have and what you are planning on adopting. So this is something that you probably can't do on your own from an IT perspective. So you would want to engage the business unit or the application owners to help you do a feature comparison to make sure that everything that you're currently using exists in this application. Now, this is important whether you're going from the same vendor on-prem potentially to the SaaS version that this vendor is offering, or if you're going from vendor A on-premises to vendor B in the cloud, so a completely different vendor in the cloud, you still want to make sure that the feature parity is there. There's a lot of SaaS applications that don't have all of the feature capabilities that the on-prem application has. Remember, these on-prem applications have been around for years. These features have compounded. When you're building a new SaaS application, it is not always the case that all of the features are there. It's going to depend on how much development work they're able to put into it, what are the features that are in demand, what can they get to quickly so that they have a viable product that they can begin to sell. So make sure that you are comparing the features. This alone can potentially be a showstopper. Now, the number two thing that you have to take into account when you're considering SaaS as well is the amount of development work that has to go into this application. So again, you're moving from one platform to another. That still means that you have to customize dashboards, you have to customize reports. So a lot of these things will require development work. They will come at a cost. So you want to also make sure that you're assessing whether or not your business is ready to make this investment and whether this investment is necessary, is needed. What are the benefits? What are you going to get in exchange for moving to SaaS and making these investments? So the investment in development work is something that you should also take into account, but there's also a cost that's associated with user training. Remember, your users are used to using this application potentially for years. Now you're moving them to a different platform. The productivity level is most definitely going to take some form of a hit because now you have to invest in training these users on this new platform. So take that into account as well, the amount of time it's going to take and the amount of money that it's going to take to get your users comfortable with this new platform. Number three has to do with lock-in. Now, this is especially the case for higher education customers. I've seen that a lot with higher education customers where they'll pick a SaaS vendor and they'll realize later on that this was the only SaaS vendor in the space. So as you're assessing your SaaS provider, make sure you're able to identify a secondary provider, and not just any secondary provider. This secondary provider has to have the means, the capabilities, the know-how, the documentation, potentially the plugins, the automation to migrate you from the current SaaS platform that you're on to their SaaS platform. So make sure you have an exit strategy. This opens up the conversation for an exit strategy out of the SaaS application. This isn't because you might exit the application. This is simply to know your options before you actually enter the application. Before you get to a point where the vendor's like, well, I can give you all of your data, but they're the only vendor in the space. Well, the data's useless. What are you going to do with that data if there's nowhere to ingest that data and no application to manipulate it? So what we want to understand when we are using a SaaS alternative application, if we're going to go to SaaS, is there a plan B for this SaaS? So if you're moving your ERP system, let's say from SAP on-prem to, let's say we're going to Dynamics 365. Okay, now if I ever want to exit Microsoft Dynamics 365, where would I go? Would I go back on premises? What is the effort needed there? What is the infrastructure? What is the cost? You're probably not going to want to do this. This is going to be a nightmare, of an operational nightmare, especially if the data center doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have the square footage, if there's even a data center left. So you're going to be looking at a SaaS alternative. So does SAP, for example, do they have a SaaS alternative if you want to ever exit Microsoft Dynamics 365? Do they have consultants that can help you? Do they have documentation? Are they prepared to move you out? That becomes really, really important for you to understand. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is just because you're going to a SaaS application doesn't mean you shouldn't ask questions about what they're doing from a high availability and resiliency perspective. So you want to know where they're hosting their application. Are they hosting their application on AWS? Is it on Azure? Is it on Google? Is it on more than one cloud provider? Are they deploying across availability zones? Are they deploying across multiple regions? These questions are all important because it gives you a sense for the resiliency. So should something happen in one availability zone, at least you'll know that they are prepared from an HA perspective and they've got failover or maybe even an active deployment. Maybe something happens with the region, you'll know that there's a secondary region involved, and you'll know that potentially their plans call for a second provider in the extreme cases that they can fail over to that provider as well. So how is this application architected? Sometimes you want to know this not just from a resiliency and HA perspective. You want to know this because, well, maybe you don't want to do business with AWS, or maybe you are required not to do business with AWS or Azure or Google. I'm not choosing a particular vendor here. I'm just bringing this up for the purposes of having this conversation and for giving you something to think about, which is understanding how they're architected, not because you can impact it, but just so you understand what you can expect, and also just in case there are any red flags that you need to be aware of before you do that. Now, I won't bring up the cost from a licensing perspective between the cost of SaaS versus the cost of how much it is to operate something on premises. That's always an interesting conversation. The licensing cost has a lot of operational tasks and capabilities that are also burned into that license that is not easy to compare. So I'm going to stay away from, well, this costs this much in the cloud, but I can operate for this much on premises, because it's never a fair apples to apples comparison. On premises, we tend to highlight, usually in most cases, the cost of the hardware, and we forget in most cases to highlight how much downtime is costing us, how much patching and upgrading is costing us. The operational aspects of maintaining the application are not always easy to quantify, and as a result, the cost comparison I'm going to stay away from. It's something you certainly want to consider, but that's not usually why you're migrating to a software as a service. You're migrating for the richness of features, for the rapid deployment of new features, to offload the operational aspects, for the resilience. There's a million and one reasons, but you definitely want to do your homework. So, is the migration to SaaS automatic just because there's a SaaS alternative? No. You have to do your homework before you do that. All right, Eli, so for conversation purposes, let's say we've determined SaaS is not the route we want to go. Does that mean that we automatically are going to go with platform as a service or PaaS? And the answer is, it depends, not necessarily. So if SaaS is not an option, then PaaS is not automatically the other option. There's a misconception out there that in order to leverage the public cloud, you have to re-architect and redesign. Otherwise, there are no cost benefits, there are no operational benefits, and we don't want to use IaaS. There's a lot of customers that have decided to skip the IaaS layer completely. My advice to you is you will at some point leverage IaaS. There is no escaping IaaS. You want to minimize IaaS, I'll give you that. But don't think for a second that you'll be able to completely avoid using infrastructure as a service. Sometimes you're going to move applications to IaaS because these applications are in support of other things happening in the public cloud, whether it's PaaS or SaaS. So you might want to move it. Maybe you're left with few applications on premises and it's just not worth keeping a data center for these applications. You move them to IaaS. These are old applications. Sometimes they don't even have the documentation. So you're moving them from point A to point B, but you're keeping them as an IaaS. So IaaS is going to be that supportive layer. And today with containers and Kubernetes and Docker and all of these things becoming incredibly popular, especially from a portability perspective, IaaS is back in play. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about IaaS. You don't have to re-architect or redesign. It's not mandatory to do that when you're considering moving to the public cloud, especially when you're moving to PaaS. But what are some of the things to also consider when you're moving to PaaS? If you want to redesign or re-architect your application on PaaS, I think that's fantastic. That elevates your capabilities. It opens up a rich ecosystem of features and services. And if you're able to do it and it's justifiable, I would go down that route for sure. But it does bring up some things that you have to be aware of. It now puts you into you become a software development shop, right? So if you're re-architecting this application, then guess what? There's a lot of integrations that are going to happen between different services. There's a lot of custom development that needs to go in to write code to make certain things work. You are now a software development shop, which means not only are you going to have to configure this initially, but you also have to maintain this moving forward. So that comes also at a cost. So make sure you understand the implications of these types of decisions. Now, if you already have a development team, then that is easier for you. But if you have to bring in or build a new development team and you're an enterprise organization that maybe aren't used to this, keep that in mind that you now are turning into an enterprise development shop. So you have to take into account all of the consequences of this decision. Now, from an IT perspective, there are things that IT can do when you're moving an application and not necessarily keep it at the IaaS level, right? So this is what we call maybe refactoring the application, which means we're going to move the application, but we're going to change certain things of its architecture. For example, on premises, you might have a 3-tier application that consists of a web server farm or one web server, one application server, and one database server. You've decided you want to move this to the cloud, but you're not necessarily going to go to SaaS, and you don't want to get a software development team involved, but you want to use PaaS services. So one of the things, or some of the things that you can do is, for example, from a database application perspective, you can consider an AWS RDS for that option. You can consider an Azure SQL to replace the current database. So instead of moving the actual virtual machine and hosting a new virtual machine on AWS or on Azure or on Google, use the as a service options, the database as a service options that they are offering you. You have now refactored the application. So you've brought in some PaaSness to this application. And the same thing goes with your web server farm. So instead of moving the web server farm, you've got 10 web servers in this web server farm. You move them, from point A to point B. So 10 here on-prem, you move 10 onto the cloud. Let's create an auto-scaling group. Let's put the minimum number of servers in there. Let's create some automation and some policies and some rules that say that once the auto-scaling group hits a threshold of CPU or memory, we're going to add or remove servers. We've refactored the application. We've pacified this application to a certain degree, and we haven't necessarily gotten the application owners involved and not necessarily gotten a full software development team involved. So there are things that you can do as you're moving the application to optimize the application. Doing this will have a good impact on the cost of maintaining and running the application in the cloud. And you're also taking advantage of PaaS services. This could be a good stepping stone between completely just doing a rehost, basically moving from point A to point B, and optimizing as you're moving from point A to point B. But what about IaaS, Elias? Does that mean, if we want to use IaaS, that it's easy to use IaaS? I wouldn't categorize IaaS as being easy. I would categorize IaaS as being easier than the other tiers. And IaaS also provides you the least amount of lock-in and offers you the most portability possible. So when you're using IaaS, you're essentially using virtual machines or containers, and you've got your data. So if you're able to replicate or synchronize this data to a secondary provider, for example, you're able to move from provider A to provider B with relative ease. And when I say move, I'm not talking about making this move 2 or 3 times a day. I'm saying if you want to ever move out from an exit strategy perspective, you're able to basically pick up your containers, VMs, and data, and the only thing that the amount of time it'll take you to replicate is the amount of time needed to migrate from point A to point B. So very high degrees of portability, very low degrees of lock-in, but then you also erode the whole value proposition of why you went to cloud, which is to gain these rich feature sets, these rich services. So again, when you're going to cloud, it has to be a combination of IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. That is where you're going to find that sweet spot that's going to make financial and cost sense. That is when you're going to be able to leverage the cloud for what it truly is, but also continue to operate some of the applications that you've been operating on premises. But now, if you want to move an application to IaaS, there are considerations that you also have to take into account. I wouldn't recommend that you do, for example, a V2V or a virtual to virtual migration. And I wouldn't recommend that for the same reasons I didn't recommend P2V when P2V was still popular back in the virtualization days. P2V was super cool when it first came out, right? Physical to virtual, taking a physical server and turning it into a virtual machine in a matter of minutes, right? That was super cool. But then when we went to manage and operate this virtual machine, we realized all of the problems that came with it. Whether it tried to migrate drivers and SCSI cards that were incompatible, it just created a nightmare. And in most cases, what people ended up doing was they would essentially redeploy on the virtual environment green, right? In a fresh manner. This is what you're going to be faced with when you're migrating to the cloud as well. So as you're migrating from an on-premises environment that's highly virtualized to IaaS, let's just stick with IaaS here. Depending on how much time you have, you might not have a choice except to do a V2V. And in this case, you will get the right tools because maybe your data center release is coming up and you have to move out. Yes, at that point, move the virtual machines and then we can clean them up, now that we have more time. But if you're not pressed for time and you're trying to move some things out of your on-premises data center and onto your public IaaS provider, then I would highly recommend that you deploy them in a green manner, in a clean manner. Now, what that will usually also entail is good documentation. So understanding that you have all of the documentation to be able to redeploy this application and configure this application. I've worked enough in the corporate space in the enterprise to understand that there are some applications we just don't touch. We don't even walk past some servers. We don't want to breathe heavy next to some servers. I get that. Those applications, you potentially don't want to move to the cloud. You're just opening up a can of worms. But for the applications that either have good documentation or applications that you have expertise in, that you have confidence that you can move this application, those applications can and should move. And this again, highlights the importance of understanding, categorizing the applications that you've assessed, that you have the good documentation for, that you have the expertise for, and that have passed all of the requirements to move to IaaS, then this application would need to move. Now, as you're moving to IaaS, you also want to take into account licensing. Whether or not the vendor of this application will accept that this application run on the public cloud provider. We had this issue with virtualization with VMware back in the day where certain vendors would not certify the application to work on VMware. Certain vendors would not allow their license to operate on top of VMware. So part of your due diligence is to also make sure that the license that you have will work on these IaaS environments. I think these occurrences are fewer nowadays, but it's still something that you want to check the mark and at least know that you've looked into. So let's bring this home. So is SaaS automatically the option if we're migrating from on-premises to the cloud? The answer is no. The answer is it depends. And the answer is you have to do your due diligence and you should be looking at SaaS first, evaluating SaaS first. That should be your first option. And if it meets all of the requirements and all of the things that we've discussed, then yes, move it to SaaS. Then you move to PaaS. Is PaaS the second natural alternative if SaaS is not an option? The answer is the same. It also depends, and no, it's not always necessary that you're going to move to PaaS. You also have to go through your due diligence, understand what you're taking on, the risks that are associated with what you're taking on when you're migrating to PaaS, all of the different integrations that you are now responsible for, all of the different things that you are now responsible for in terms of patching, releasing. Again, you're turning into a software development shop. And we also talked about what you need to think of when you're moving to IaaS, all the different things, the different requirements that you have to consider as you're moving to IaaS. So in conclusion, how do you decide between IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS? The answer is it depends, and it's going to depend on each application individually. This isn't something that you're going to do in bulk. This is something that you're going to take on an application by application basis. You're going to assess, you're going to go through some of these requirements, and then you're going to categorize these applications and say, we've done these 5 applications. These 5 applications are going to SaaS. They've passed everything. Let's go operationalize these 5 applications, and so on and so forth until you're done with the rest of your application portfolio. Finally, I hope this information was very helpful, very useful. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Let me know if this was helpful. Let me know if I've missed something. Let me know your experience, what you went through as you were considering moving to the cloud, whether it's SaaS, PaaS, or IaaS, some of the challenges that maybe you've encountered that maybe I didn't mention here. I'd love to learn from you. Hopefully just as much as you're getting value and information from me in this video. If you like this video, do me a favor, hit that like, subscribe, again, leave a comment, hit that notification bell so that you're alerted the next time I upload a video. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I love you all, and I'll see you in the next one.